Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à ce webinaire conjoint entre H20 Lyon et le réseau Rivière TV. Donc on est très heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui. Quelques mots pour commencer sur H20 Lyon, très courtement. Donc on est une école universitaire de recherche qui a été fondée en 2018 et qui est financée par l'État. On travaille autour de 4 grands piliers
work on 4 main pillars when it comes to integrated management of water. So there's a lot of multidisciplinarity. We work on the link between training and research, between research and the socioeconomic world, and the link between what's developing nationally and what's developing on the international scene. And as part of this, we organize different actions over the course of the year. You'll find more information on our website, and every year we have one or several foreigners. This year we have Joe Wheaton from the Utah University, who's a geomorphologist, and he's going to be talking to us today and presenting this webinar on low-tech process-based restoration of riverscapes. Please make sure that you switch your microphones and cameras off, especially the microphones. That's very important for the translation. And I'm going to hand over to Antoine from the Réseau Rivière. Thank you very much. Yes, this evening, this is an international webinar. We have people from abroad with us who are taking part. I can see that we have 250 people who have signed up for the webinar. So we've got quite an eclectic audience, and we're going to try and be as interactive as possible. Now, with respect to the way things work for questions and answers, you will be able to use the chat function, which is at the bottom of the page if you have a question. And Claire Lyse and I will take the questions at the end of the presentation. Now, the presentation will last about 1 hour maximum with Joe Wheaton, who will introduce himself in just a moment. Then we will have questions and answers. The first hour will be translated by Bernie Goth, who will be with us, but she will not be able to stay over 6 o'clock. So the translation will be by us. So please be patient with us. So I'm going to hand over straight over to Claire Lyse, who's going to tell you how the translation works and other technical matters. Thank you, Antoine. Yes, so please feel free throughout the presentation to ask your questions using the chat button. We will pick them up progressively and read them out at the end. So the webinar will be simultaneously translated in French and into English. If you want to switch your language, you need to go to the bar at the bottom of the screen, click on the globe and choose your channel, either English or French. For questions, you can ask your questions in French or in English, which is whatever the easiest language for you. So that's my introduction, and we're now going to hand over to Joe Wheaton, who's going to talk to us about restoration and low-tech solutions. So, Joe, you can share your PowerPoint. And you have the floor, Joe.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. I'm excited to be here with you all virtually. I'm actually physically in Lyon still, nearing the end of sabbatical that was made possible thanks to H20 Lyon and the Collegium here at the University of Lyon. And I would like to also extend my thanks to the whole H20 Lyon staff who helped organize not just this webinar, but so much. And then a big apology to Bernie for how fast I have a habit of talking. I'll try to slow down, but I'm terrible. So anyway, what we're going to talk about today is a form of restoration for trying to bring back healthier riverscapes. And what I want to really emphasize is that this is process-based restoration, and it's really about letting riverscapes do the work. So the purpose is to share a perspective on ways that we might reimagine some of our rivers and streams as something bigger, as healthy riverscapes. And hopefully in sharing that perspective, maybe there's some ways of explaining things that you might find helpful in communicating with the audiences and the groups that you work with. And the experience I'll be drawing on is primarily from US, and it's on one way that we can achieve healthier riverscapes. It's by no means the only way. And this particular method is about leveraging natural processes and specifically trying to use low-tech structures to help us do sort of some of the initial kickstarting of that. I do have a tendency to probably fire hose too much information, so apologies in advance. Don't feel like you have to digest all of it. I'll try and slow down on the most important points, and then if you're interested in any of it, we have a website that has most of what I'll be covering here is there free for you to download. There's also self-guided modules, a manual, etc. So I will put up at the end a link to the slides, and those will also be available via the H20 Lyon site. So in terms of our agenda, what I'd like to do is start by elaborating on what we mean by riverscapes, and something we're all well aware of, just how depressing the overall scope of their degradation is. And then I'll offer some principles of riverscape health that we've found helpful for sort of distilling a lot of science and different ways of saying things into some pretty basic concepts that help us understand what current conditions are and look at what recovery potential might be. I think in general, we tend to undersell what's possible in a lot of our riverscapes. We'll talk about low-tech and a few examples. We'll highlight the key processes that we need to be thinking about restoring, or more aptly getting out of the way of. And then we'll conclude with some principles, not on healthy riverscapes, but on sort of putting our restoration actions in context. And so that'll be our sort of agenda. And as was mentioned, you can put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So first off, what's a riverscape? Well, it's a made-up word. It's been with us since at least the 1940s. Obviously, just juxtapose river and scape, hints of a landscape, hints of a river. So even if no one's seen it before, they can usually sort of infer its meaning. But let's go a little deeper. A riverscape, clearly must include the channels, right? This is pretty obvious. It's going to be the aquatic habitat, the riverscapes, if you will. That's the whole drainage network of these. But the channels themselves are not enough. A riverscape is more than just the channels. It's also more than just the remnant corridor of riparian and wetlands that still remain along its edges. These broader floodplains, even if they're not currently flooding, they're not actively flooding, they could. And this brings us to a definition, which we find helpful, which is really equating these riverscapes locally with the valley bottom. And if you've just arrived, make sure to mute yourself. Our definition here is a riverscape is the part of the landscape that could plausibly flood by these channels in the contemporary natural flow regime. So that's sort of loaded, but the important words here are, could plausibly, which is a nod to, it doesn't necessarily mean it is currently, because in a lot of our systems, current conditions are preventing these rivers from reaching those floodplains, and oftentimes very deliberately. And then the contemporary natural flow regime, well, in a lot of places we've withdrawn a lot of water. We have a lot of manipulation of these water resources, and so we may not be dealing with a natural flow regime. All this translates to it's a bigger chunk of the landscape than we often assume when we just talk about a river channel and its floodplain. We tend to undersell. And some riverscapes are really quite easy to read. They're sort of topographically, if you will, obvious. On this particular riverscape on the top here, there's a big outwash terrace that's clearly not going to plausibly flood in the contemporary flow regime. Maybe there's nice grade breaks between the uplands, the lowlands, and in a healthy system, the whole thing is pretty obvious where the floodplain is sort of told by a mix of the riparian and the wetlands and where the channels are. So that's fine, but others and many other riverscapes are harder to read because our footprints are all over them. And sometimes the edges of them, where to find that valley bottom isn't quite so obvious, whether we're talking about what we might just think of as a roadside ditch, but once was a stream, its own riverscape, versus mighty rivers that have been harnessed and straitjacketed. We have a lot of riverscapes that look deceptively good to most people. Why do they look good? Because there's some green vegetation along them. No, that must be, it must be just fine. But if you take a closer look, for example, at this riverscape, this is a riverscape that is a product of a bulldozer. There was a big flood that came through, a river behaving like, it should, arguably, and the response was to run the bulldozer down, put the channel in its place, and put the spoils off to the side. And since then, this is recovered with vegetation. So it looks, okay, but it's a bowling alley. It's simplified. There's very little habitat value here, and it's certainly starved of structure like wood and to a certain degree, sediment. And so when we start talking a little later here about low-tech process-based restoration, our sort of underlying hypothesis is one of structural starvation. And the time frame that I'm showing on this graph from Riemann et al., which is for the Columbia River Basin, will be very different in different parts of the US and different parts of Europe. European timelines are going to extend way back in terms of our major impacts, but the sort of mix of resource extraction and land uses that are these sort of assaults, if you will, on our riverscapes, many of them lead to starvation of some of our primary sources of structure, wood and beaver most notably. There are lots of ways that we can look at the gloom and doom of how bad things are. And no matter how we sort of summarize that, the scope of riverscape degradation is really difficult to overstate. It's absolutely massive, and we realize this, and this is reflected in public spending in many countries on restoration efforts. But most of those efforts go to tiny postage stamp little projects. If they start getting above a kilometer or a few kilometers, that's a big project. And price tags here in France, you could easily spend upwards of €1 million on a kilometer. But that leaves, literally millions of kilometers in need, neglected. Another part of our problem is ecological amnesia. We forgot what, if you will, sort of reference conditions were, or what's possible. And in some cases, here in Europe, it's really difficult when some of these riverscapes have got, over 2,000 years of manipulation. A lot of scientists, we thought that, you see this sort of thing with this beaver dam and this sort of structural forced multi-threaded flow, we would think that this is an anomaly. And what we've been learning slowly and stubbornly is that these weren't anomalies. These were pervasive throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Ben Goldfarb does a nice job of describing this in his book, Eager. There's lots of different syntheses and conceptualizations of this, as well as empirical data being published in the scientific literature in the past 15 years. And, you know, we throw jargon at it, stage 0, 8, anastomosing, but ways of talking about how important structural forcing was. If you want to hear more about that, a bunch of the free modules that we have on the website, there's recordings and lectures that you can listen to. So Mark Beardsley has a really nice way of describing what's possible, reimagining riverscapes, and he uses actually this analogy of soup, which is kind of fun. So let's dive into a riverscape health analogy, and let's try and synthesize some of what's coming out of the literature with 3 simple principles. The riverscape health analogy builds off of, you know, health analogies have been used for rivers for, you know, at least 30 to 40 years. And we can ask ourselves, what's a healthy diet for a riverscape? And if you ponder that for a minute, I mean, water should come to mind, right? So natural flow regime. There's a lot of geomorphologists probably on the call, so sediment, but also other things from life, organic matter, wood, beaver dams, etc. And different rivers have different metabolisms, a different ability to process that diet, you know, at different rates. They also exercise. What is the role of exercise in a riverscape? Well, it's really the geomorphic processes, as well as life imprinted on top of that, that lead to turnover and new habitats and new geomorphic units, channels shifting, etc., accessing that riverscape. So if you think about the example of beaver and what they do, they're dramatically modifying the diet of a riverscape locally, right? They're bringing these terrestrial subsidies by dragging in, for example, aspen off of hill slopes down into the channels. And our premise, as we think about this health analogy with regards to most restoration practices, is that too many of them are akin to just one part of medicine, and that is, you know, invasive surgery. We do, you know, reconstructive surgery, you go in and I'm going to fix it. And one of the things that we forget, we may put a cast on if someone breaks a bone, but we're usually putting those casts back in rivers in the form of riprap or, you know, stabilization, and we're over focusing on control and not focusing on the sort of healing and the exercise that that system might need to do. And so what we're trying to do with low-tech process-based restoration is think of our actions more akin to, you know, preparing a healthy meal that might provide some nourishment that system can digest. Our ultimate goal is not to be in the business of feeding meals to these systems, but to coexist with them in a way that they could feed themselves. So we've taken sort of a lot of ideas that are in the literature and sort of boiled it down to 3 things. Riverscapes need space, healthy riverscapes, that is. Structure forces complexity, and that builds resilience. And the opposite of how we've managed most of our rivers, that is for efficient conveyance of water, is actually a good thing. And the idea is that if these principles are realized, we should be supporting greater rates of biodiversity. We should be self-sustaining this natural infrastructure, this part of the landscape, and allowing easier coexistence and adaptation to, for example, the climate crisis along and within these riverscapes. And our sort of get out of jail free card on this is what sort of transcends these different principles, is this idea of, well, how important are these different things in a specific riverscape, say a gorge versus a big, you know, braided river? Well, it depends. And it depends are our favorite 2 words in the natural sciences. and they are very much overused. So this is why you go get a degree in ecology or geomorphology or whatnot, so that you can articulate what it depends on and why there's differences in, say, a gorge, versus a big meandering system. If we elaborate on those just a tiny bit, streams need space. They need this space to sort of adjust, to exercise. And if we can read and interpret valley bottoms, we have a good hint as to how much space they needed in the past to do this. And this idea is not at all new. Here in France, Hervé Piguet, one of my hosts and collaborators, has been pushing this idea of an erodible river corridor, which has been taken up here in practice in a big way, and this is communicated in different countries in different ways, right? Space for the river, freedom space, natural flood management, fluvial hazard zones, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of ways to get at this. Another way of thinking about it is, we could probably get away with taking some kids in a classroom and just locking them in that classroom and sitting them in their seats, and they're just going to work all day, no recess. And we might get away with that for a while, but at some point that is going to boil over and backfire in a very miserable way for that teacher. This is sort of what we've done, in my opinion, with too many riverscapes. We haven't provided the playground. And it isn't just, giving them some place to exercise and run around and play means that you're going to let them, leave campus and go, anywhere. We can constrain that. The playground is the valley bottom, right? This is the place in which we can expect, some screaming and yelling and some tears and some, laughs of joy or whatever. And so these simple sorts of ways of sort of conveying the concepts that we sort of muddy up and fancy up with a lot of jargon in the literature. Some scientists will hate this. I don't care. I'm not talking to scientists for this. This is some ideas about how we distill what we're trying to get at and communicate with broader audiences. The second principle is structure forces complexity, and that builds resilience. And there's a lot to unpack in this, but let's just do it a piece at a time. So in these illustrations that Macy Richards has done for us, here she's emphasizing the structure like woody debris jams or beaver dams. In, say, a wet meadow system, it could be, rhizomatous root mats. That structure basically makes things more complex. It starts with changing the hydraulics. Fancy way of saying it makes things deeper or shallower, faster or slower, right? Those changes in the hydraulics from something uniform and monotonous to something diverse and even something that sounds interesting actually amplifies and modulates geomorphic processes, things like the erosion, deposition, transport, and the storage of sediment. And that leaves in its wake these much more complex geomorphic units, which are much more interesting habitat. The other thing that happens when we have structural forcing, particularly when so much of it is by organic matter, life, things that are actually alive, not just sediment, these become much more resilient deposits. If I give you a garden hose and a sandbox, fill it with sand, and you start spraying that garden hose all over the sandbox, that is a very vulnerable deposit. However, if we built that sandbox up with some sand, but also, I don't know, some leaf litter, some mosses, or some sticks, some organic matter, right? Now you're mixing together a whole bunch of stuff of a whole bunch of different sizes, and life is taking hold. Things will grow in that. And this becomes this rich carbon fiber matrix that's a much more resilient way to rebuild a valley bottom than just with sediment alone. So it turns out resilience, something that most of us sort of strive towards, it's the capacity to recover quickly from disturbance. And disturbances that we can find a lot of common ground with a lot of people that we're afraid of and are exacerbated by climate change. Things like fire, things like floods, things like droughts. Well, those are natural processes that have been exacerbated, but if we have healthier riverscapes, we can weather those sorts of events much better. In this picture, Macy's trying to show that, here's a fire, but this fire took place. That's a natural process, and it even produced this, big debris flow and landslide. But the infrastructure survived. The natural infrastructure of this riverscape is still there. So sometimes it's healthy, or something is helpful, I apologize, when we're talking to different groups where we don't have to be so specific about what it is that they care about, that they want to be resilient. Some of us might be coming at it from trying to save fish populations or just a healthy riverscape in general. But for others, it might just be, I'd like my home to still survive as these floods and fires and droughts, persist. Here's an example that's fairly obvious. This is a landscape that had a major fire, and the vast majority of it, the riparian area, burnt to the ground. It was not resilient. This is a complicated concept right here. Water does not burn, right? That's what happened is we had structural forcing by beaver. They built these dams, they wetted up the valley bottom sponge, and you had this refugia during the fire for wildlife, for livestock. And then you have this much more resilient, preserved habitat, if you will, post-fire to weather the post-fire runoff and the sediment and ash and debris flows. That's a big deal. Our third principle is the inefficient conveyance of water is healthy. And what we mean by that is not that everything should be inefficient. The extreme of this would be a reservoir. What we really mean is that stuff is, stuff is varied. And so by stuff, I mean the movement of mass through the system: water, sediment, nutrients, wood, etc. So there's places where some of it can move quite quickly and have rather short residence times, but there's other places where often from structural forcing, we get engagement, even at low flows, out onto floodplain surfaces, into side channels, into beaver ponds, etc., that really slow the flow, and in some of these cases, slow it extremely through infiltration into groundwater, and we get these much longer residence times and keep that sponge saturated. A way of quantifying this really simply is just to look at the inundated extent of water. And what we're looking at here in the right-hand side, this little riverscape, you can clearly see has been dammed up by some beaver. The lower left is basically a map of that. The upper left is a map of that same riverscape a few years before beaver had come back and built their dams there. And these two maps are at the exact same discharge: low flow, base flow. And the map on the top, only 5% of the valley bottom is inundated. On the map on the bottom, 20%. This is crazy. We refer to this as the water magic trick because there's not any more water through time. The same exact discharge coming in and trickling out at the bottom is what we see between both of these events. It's just that in this one, the structural forcing has diversified the flow field so much. We've got this inefficiency that we literally do have more aquatic habitat, but without any more flow. And that's pretty remarkable. It turns out this is remarkably consistent too across hugely diverse riverscapes and physiographic settings. So one of the ways we can kind of reinforce recognizing what healthy looks like is to kind of also look at what unhealthy is by comparing these things. So if we kind of work backwards, this is how we've managed many of our riverscapes for efficient conveyance, right? Drainage, 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 let it pass. The best example I can think of is the Los Angeles River. Isn't this beautiful? A very easy thing to calculate discharge in. Another example from Germany, but we all have rivers like this. Over here, this is what will give most hydraulic engineers a heart attack if you ask them to quantify it. But this is a beaver-infested mess, right? This is beaver dam complexes slowing the flow, making it inefficient. Certainly not winning the race, but maybe winning the fitness battle. Structure forces complexity and builds resilience. We get these structurally rich and resilient systems versus these systems that we rip all the structure out because we're concerned it's going to plug up a bridge or a culvert. And ironically and paradoxically, we actually make these structurally starved systems more vulnerable to disturbance. And you know, obviously, what we do in most of our riverscapes is we diverted them, pollute them, encroach them. Now, it's tempting to conclude from this that the only way you can get healthy is, you know, to come back to some sort of utopian, you know, it's all or nothing. And that's nonsense. There's a lot of incremental things that we can do to make small claims back and have healthier riverscapes. It's not like, you know, the difference between me as a couch potato or, you know, some Olympic athlete that I'll never be. You know, I have to choose between those two. Something in between those and tending towards and aspiring towards the Olympic athlete is what we're talking about. So what's low-tech process-based restoration? It's not new. There's a lot of different techniques that have been around for a long time that we've discovered, forgotten, you know, rediscovered, reinvented, etc. This includes things. Make sure to mute yourself if you're just joining. This includes things like, you know, rock sort of erosion control structures, lots of methods of getting wood into systems, simple things like just intensive grazing management to actually keep livestock moving, not necessarily excluding them, but just keep them moving to allow vegetation to recover. So these things are not a new idea, like I mentioned, and in fact, here in France, just down in the Drôme, there's wonderful examples from the 1870s to the 1890s of afforestation, replanting, lots of Austrian pine, but then also these low-tech structures put in what had turned into gullies and stuff from these hill slopes unraveling in the wake of intensive subsistence agriculture on the hill slopes. So there's lots of different ways to go about this. And one of the fun things, if you lean into that analogy, is the meal preparers can be a lot more diverse than just somebody who is qualified to run a piece of heavy equipment. So the P in process-based restoration, those few of you tuning in from the States will recognize Pabst Blue Ribbon. Those of you from Europe, if you've visited the States, I hope this isn't the only beer you've sampled, but it is sort of known as blue collar beer, but truth be told, it's more of a hipster beer. But this is not Pabst Blue Ribbon. This is process-based restoration, an idea, a concept that's been around for some time. And we're talking about some low-tech flavors of it. We've tried to distill this into a standard of practice in this design manual, which is free on that website, and pocket guides that try to kind of communicate the basics and then provide agencies and regulatory bodies with some standards that people can purport that they are following. What our sort of contribution to this space was a few additional low-tech structures to add to that sort of cookbook, if you will. And mainly we were focused on some structures that promote the process of wood accumulation and structures that promote the process of beaver dam activity. The confusion people have, and we've seen this a lot in the US, where they just hear the low-tech part and they get really excited about these structures. And people that are used to building structures tend to build them to last. We're not necessarily building these to last. We're building them to invoke process. So one way I could do that is maybe this little woody structure here, this post-assisted log structure, gets a bunch of wood accumulating on it. But success could also be that this thing blows out in a flood and reaccumulates on the next structure downstream and makes a far better jam than I could have built. Similarly, beaver always do a better job than we do. So in these standards of practice, we have typical construction details, et cetera, and everything has these little Creative Commons licenses on it so that people can take them, use them, adapt them at will. If you want to hear more about that, Steve Bennett's going to be giving a webinar on June 12th through IS Rivers here. But also there's a couple of modules, one from Steve on PALs, another one from Scott on BDAs, if you're interested. And there's a huge diversity of different groups doing wonderful work embracing this, everything from tribes in the nonprofit sector to federal and state agencies. So what does this look like? A few examples. Well, the one that kind of got low-tech process-based restoration, some attention was Bridge Creek. This is in Central Oregon, and the driver here was not that this was an incised stream, but it was trying to fix the incised stream to the benefit of an endangered species, a steelhead salmon population. And beaver were present in this system, and because of improvements in grazing management, there was this modest little band of riparian green groceries, vegetation along here, enough for them to build with. But when you build a dam down in a deep trench at high flows, all the pressure of the water is acting on that dam, and they often fail. And they tend to fail by end cutting. And that end cutting is bank erosion, and it's a good thing if it's not threatening a road, right? It's a good thing because it widens this trench. It creates more space that instead of trying to get up onto some old surface, you're rebuilding new surfaces, new floodplains in this wider space, and you're sourcing material to do it. And it makes it easier for beaver to come back and build something that lasts a little longer. Those eventually also breach, also can fail. But over time, these become more and more resilient, and you get to this sort of stage zero anastomosing mess, if you will. So we had some examples of this, but the timescales take way too long. And so we know beaver are opportunistic, and we asked the question, could we mimic what they do and maybe speed it up? Or could we promote them to speed it up by giving them some little bit more stable structures, not permanent structures, but things that wouldn't blow out in every flood. And so this was sort of published, and that's all great. And, a few restoration practitioners get excited, but the reason it actually got attention and credibility was this. It's because we were able to show a population level response to this endangered species of steelhead. And that response was by, some painstaking monitoring that cost orders of magnitude more than the restoration to track changes in the density of these fish, their growth, their survival, and the product of those is production. And compared to a control population, we were able to untangle this very pronounced response, which is what really gave this credibility. Nick Bowis does a much better job of talking about that in Module 2C, if you're interested. And a similar thing on the wood side, Steve talks about in Module 2D. So what does it look like when you pursue these things? Well, it starts with building a shared vision. This is an example from Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and the land trust there, where they had picked up this riverscape that had previously been relegated to the channel, pushed off to one side to drain this so it could be used for grazing. But the land trust picked this up, and this was something that could now be in play. And it was already trying to pull itself off of that valley left wall. And so we came up with a vision for, getting this back to this, system where structural forcing was a really important part of the dynamic. And the expectation management that this isn't necessarily, with low tech anyway, going to be instant. There's other ways where you might be able to get there right away, but this is a more incremental approach. And so, the idea is in red dots there, you put a bunch of structure in, and you're trying to kickstart some of these processes that are already in some places happening. You're accentuating them, and in other places they're not. And so you're encouraging them. So, you put a bunch of structures in, you watch it grow, you're waiting for your floods to do some work. You're waiting for beaver maybe to show up. And then you come in and you provide a little bit of a top up, right? To keep pushing it along towards its recovery potential. And the timing of this isn't precise. You're waiting for floods. You might get lucky. You might hit a drought for 5 years. And so this is an example here. I'll speed it up because it's a little boring. Of that same project. This isn't a huge project. It's a demonstration. It's only about a mile, or a little less than 2 kilometers. So this is, you can see the wood in here, right? A bunch of woody structures primarily. There are a few little Beaver Dam analogs out on some dry floodplain surfaces if we get engagement, but just a lot of wood, basically going from a system that had like 3 jams in it to a system that now has like 150. And also places where we're really trying to attack the floodplain there, okay? So that's a treatment, that's a meal, that's an offering. This is 3 or 4 months later, not a massive flood, but let's call it a typical flood, one that there would be fear. Oh, all this, wood, this loose wood you've put in, it's all going to float away. It's all going to cause a problem. Well, I don't know how good your memory is, but not a lot of this is washing away in these flows. A lot of it is accumulating a lot of sediment, some wood, and we're getting more purchase with the floodplain than we would have at this flow otherwise, and we're getting more diversity of in-channel habitat. And as we work our way down here, we're starting to really eat away at some of these banks and rebuild new floodplain surfaces through lateral activity. And this is kind of what some of these things can look like. So it's important that we focus on some key processes. And to emphasize this, I'm not going to focus. I'm going to do what we do as reductionist scientists. Let's talk about process-based restoration, right? The verbs, the processes, and then the nouns and the adjectives. So let's talk about hydrologic processes first, right? It starts with the water. So things like flooding floodplains, attenuating flood flows, augmenting base flow. And let's think about the hydraulics. We got to slow or deepen, speed up, shunt, split, backup water. Then we have we also have geomorphic processes, things like building up, cutting down, transporting, and storing sediment. And finally, biologic, life, right? Growth, survival, reproduction, death. So I hope this puts you to sleep at this late hour of the day. I hope that you look at this and are somewhat overwhelmed. I was. Because we started in order working through these things, right? Process-based restoration. It's, all I need to know is know a little bit about all these things, and then I can design and optimize for the first perfect project, right? Well, Janine Castro and Colin Thorne published an interesting paper recently talking about this stream evolution triangle and pointing out that we spent way too much time assuming and emphasizing just the sort of hydromorphic sides of systems, or systems in which those are the processes that dominate. But so many more systems, especially in their healthy state, are ones in which life is what really dominates. And if you want to compare, for example, stream power to the energy on the biotic side dwarfs the energy, and also is incredibly powerful at dissipating that energy. So you can just sort of set that aside into, semesters and semesters of painful coursework. But in ecology, we often focus on keystone species, because if they are doing okay, they're kind of an indicator or a bellwether that most of the other parts of that ecosystem are probably doing okay. And we can use that same idea with these processes and focus on key processes. And the key processes in process-based or low-tech process-based restoration, at least, are wood accumulation and beaver dam activity, maybe in wet meadow systems, rhizomatous root mat production. So there's a PAL buried underneath this. There's a post-assisted log structure. You can't see it because so much wood accumulated in this flood on top of it. That's the success, not whether or not there's this structure I can't even see anymore underneath it. The structure was the meal. That's our action, right? It isn't the solution. And I was out in the field the other day with Baptiste Morzot here in France, and he has some wonderful books, one of them Rekindling Life, and really talking about the importance that life plays somewhat obviously, right, in recovering some of these systems and how much we sort of fight it and we sort of forget about it. And he asked me, well, are there any key processes that don't involve life? And I can't think of any. There's important processes, but not ones that I would elevate in healthy riverscapes that don't involve life. If you want that, go to Mars. If you want to learn more about beaver, Ben Goldfarb's book's wonderful. He has a short little lecture in Module 1K. Nick Bowis talks more about some of the beaver behavior and their beaver dam activity, and that might be of interest to some of you. So let's transition to wrapping up here. So what we do. I think it's helpful to have some sideboards that sort of guide our actions, much more than, I mean, recipes are helpful to get us started, but the sort of sideboards, the principles kind of keep us on track. And so these are what we've come up with for low-tech process-based restoration, and it definitely applies to, some of them apply to other forms of restoration. Maybe not, it's okay to be messy to all, but there's strength in numbers, use natural building materials, let the system do the work, and defer decision-making to the system. And our ultimate goal is self-sustaining systems. So when we first started, we were, if you're going to put untreated wooden fence posts in, like, well, yeah, you want them perfectly plumb, like you'd put in a fence. Well, like in this example, you'd put these, logs in and put these little posts to sort of anchor them. Well, wood floats, and so in high flows, this stuff floated out and moved on downstream. And we quickly realized the more cluttered, variable the Velcro, and then putting the posts so that they crossed over each other to sort of keep things from floating away and wedging these things in, that messiness, you take inspiration from natural examples, and it's absolutely okay. I know your mom told you to always make your bed, but beavers like to make messes. And so can you. It's that messiness which really drives so many of the wonderful sort of ecosystem services that we're after. The other is stolen from the Golden State Warriors. They didn't finish out this season like we would hope with another championship, at least some of us, but strength in numbers. This is a picture or a map rather of a small portion of a much larger project. This is spanning, a little over 4 kilometers here. And every single little dot there, every single little symbol, that's a different structure. We have had such a deficit, such a legacy of structural starvation. You need to get a lot of material back into some of these systems. And sometimes it can look pretty crazy, like what I'm showing you here. I'm not going to show this whole video, but I'm going to show enough of it to convince you that it's boring. I love boring videos because it means we're hitting these systems with enough numbers, with enough scale. This was a drone video, someone that took a workshop from us back in like 2018. They went away a year or two later, and then someone sent me this link, and it was like, oh wow, look what these guys up at BLM have been doing, and they built all these structures, and they're turning what was sagebrush covered floodplains back into real floodplains, functional floodplains, and not even at that big of a flow here. And so you're seeing lots and lots of structures getting that purchase, getting multiple channels, getting all sorts of wonderful things happening. So these are solutions that can scale up to the scope of the problem. And some people will argue, well, yeah, that's great, but you can't do these in big rivers. And I only work in big rivers. Those are the important ones. Well, I won't argue that they're important, but they do only constitute, something like, 5 to 10% of the drainage network. Most of the drainage network is locked up in smaller things, sometimes uninspiring in their current form, but also a lot more tractable for really hitting some big miles. And they're incredibly important because they feed those big, proud rivers. Another part of strength in numbers is building the workforce. We're really committed to teaching professionals, to teaching next generation of professionals in this stuff. And it's a lot of fun because so many different people can get involved. In France, this is probably less important. Use natural building materials. Well, yeah, of course you would. In the US, where we have such a bad habit of making lousy food fortified with so many preservatives, God knows how long it'll last in you. But this is maybe resonates a little more. But local building materials, locally sourced materials, and really sort of a foodie mentality to have local adaptations, regional variation in the recipes, getting very creative, and a lot of pride, I think, are some of the exciting aspects of this sort of work. Let the system do the work. This is stolen from Bill Zeedyke. Let the water do the work. So geomorphic work like erosion and deposition instead of getting out grading. I love this quote from Jared McKee. What if restoration was about stream power doing the work, not diesel power? But there's more to the system than just geomorphic work. There's life, right? There's what vegetation does. There's what beaver do. There's what spawning salmon do. We can defer some of the decisions if we have a big enough playground and can provide expectation management about, yeah, there could be some chaos in that playground, but it's not going to be outside of that playground. Then we don't have to take on the liability associated with, deciding everything, deciding where, how, when, what height do I grade the floodplain to? Let the flood decide. How far do I cut this bank? Let the river decide. These are things that we need to practice a little bit of humility, but they are very, very powerful when we can hand these things over to life. And finally, we don't want to be in the business of feeding these meals forever. We want to be in the business of getting the system to a place where it can feed itself. And so what's our exit strategy on this trajectory of mimicking, promoting, and sustaining process? This is an example where beaver translocated and how they sort of quickly took over and got to a self-sustaining state. 25 BDAs over a half a kilometer. Beaver came in and they were extirpated from the system. So we built these Beaver Dam analogs to release them into, and now they've built nearly 250 additional ones and maintained all but 2 of what we built. And they've spread out to more than 5 kilometers. Those are the sorts of multiplier effects that we need to see out of our efforts. And my good friend Jay Wild tells this story of that last slide way better than I do. And I take him all over to different workshops and have him tell this story, and it resonates. It's really powerful. And I think this is how we can get to these ultimate goals of self-sustaining systems. So I will leave you with, it's okay to do things you thought you weren't supposed to, like let life happen. We don't have to exercise so much control. There's partnerships with the people, there's partnerships with these systems. Thinking of them as living systems, thinking specifically about the life within them is really helpful. I think having a shared vision of resiliency is helpful no matter where you are. In the American West, we've had a lot of traction with groups like Sage Grouse Initiative, Working Land for Wildlife, lots of ranchers and farmers in this resiliency of re-wetting the valley bottom sponge, right? I don't know what it's going to be here. Maybe it's a shared vision of resiliency around free evolution, rekindling life, right? This is an example of BDAs, I'll show you in a moment, built at this Grand Laval farm. And thanks to Baptiste Morizot, who, oh no, my video's not going to show. Oh, well, it's basic. Oh, here it goes.
This is so great.
So this was a riverscape, believe it or not, relegated to culverts. We tore the culverts out, giving part of the farm back to that riverscape. And just go back here for a second. Those are the kids who helped build these simple little BDAs along with 30 wonderful volunteers. And they were testing this out minutes afterwards to make sure that it was also good kid habitat for play and swimming. This place will be unrecognizable when life takes hold. in very short order, and it will be a much more inspiring thing than the culvert it was. So I really like Michael Pollan's In Defense of Food, and I think of process-based restoration sort of like the carrot in Defense of Food. He describes nutrition science, a science that's very reductionist and thinks, well, if we can understand the building blocks of food, the ingredients, the nutrients, then we should be able to, make an artificial version of that food. And, the real reason for making artificial food is it's much more profitable than real food. But, much to scientists' confusion and disappointment, for some reason that artificial food, the artificial carrot, isn't as good for us as the real carrot. And what Michael concludes is just eat the damn carrot. Who cares, right? It's better for us. We don't need to know exactly why. Scientists will continue to strive on why. But from a management perspective, use the carrot. And there's an analogy that I think crosses over here into letting these systems do the work. And so I'll leave you with a reminder that, some ideas of recognizing what healthy and unhealthy looks like, and some of those health principles, and some restoration principles that kind of contextualize our actions and what we can do, not to make it healthy, but let it and facilitate it getting back to healthy on its own. And we'll leave it there.
Merci beaucoup, Joe, pour cette présentation. On a déjà pas mal de questions.
Thanks very much, Joe. We've got a lot of questions already. Antoine, do you want to start? Yes. So Bernie will be leaving us. So let's just organize things. Yeah, thanks, Joe. So how are we going to work things? I'll just translate this bit. Can you hear? Let's just see if we can do it. I'm going to start with the first question. I'm going to read it in English. I'll leave you now, Joe.
Okay, thank you.
We will try to go on without your help. Thank you very much. So, Joe, you hear me? It's okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I will read the French question, and after I will translate it. I
Sounds
try.
great.
Alors, first question in French. Quelle compatibilité avec les risques d'inondation en amont des villes et des villages? So, let me translate, please. So, what compatibility with flood risk upstream of town villages?
So so with the compatibility
please.
with low-tech.
Please, we will do a translation with direct. So be slow and let us time to answer. To translate.
Okay. There is a lot of compatibility. There's often fear that wood and beaver dams, if they blow out,
okay,
will wash downstream. Go ahead.
Tu prends la traduction en français ou pas,
Comme tu veux, vas-y.
Ok. Donc il y a beaucoup de peur sur la capacité ou en tout cas la possibilité des structures bois d'être transférées à l'aval suite à des inondations. Please go ahead, Joe.
But when you get these systems up to the sort of densities of wood, densities of dams that you would have had in them, the stuff doesn't move as far. So it's actually providing some protection because the material is not necessarily washing down. It's more likely to hang up on Velcro.
Okay.
And it's also providing flood attenuation.
Ok. Donc en fait, du fait qu'on multiplie les structures bois qui vont elles-mêmes être alimentées, parce qu'en fait elles sont construites pour s'auto-alimenter avec le bois qui descend de l'amont, en fait le bois qui descend ne va pas faire 10 km forcément jusqu'à l'aval, il va être stoppé en cours de route. Pour le principe, c'est que plus il y a de complexité dans la rivière, moins le bois peut aller loin. Alors ça ne s'applique pas forcément à toutes les rivières, mais sur certaines largeurs, ça peut jouer. I completed because in case of whites with different rivers, it's not the same trend.
Yep.
So please go ahead.
I mean, yeah, like we can leave it there for now. It's yeah, that's, I mean, also gets back to it depends, right? So it depends on exactly where you are. There are places where there's too many constraints and it doesn't make sense, but we've also done these sorts of projects in more urbanized areas and it just requires a little more careful planning.
Ok. Donc en fait, bien sûr, ça va dépendre de l'endroit où on se trouve. Et en fait, il y a des cas où on peut aussi le faire dans des zones urbaines, mais il faudra prendre plus ou moins de sécurité, de marge de sécurité. Et d'ailleurs, je complète en disant qu'on a déjà vu une visio l'année dernière avec H2O Lyon sur le design, l'ingénierie de ces structures bois. Donc en fait, l'USDA Forest a des modes de calcul pour piéger et structurer les bouts de bois pour qu'ils ne bougent pas. Donc en fait, il y a, entre guillemets, science de la fixation qui permet de s'assurer, je dirais, dans la majorité des cas, la sécurité. Complete. So we had a webinar last year with H2O Lyon about wood fixation with Bob Gubernik from USDA Forest. There is all engineering about and science about how to fix wood in the rivers. And so we could get you the link with this video and also with the USDA Forest Guide, who include all this possibility to be sure that wood can be stay in place at a certain level of risk. And the conclusion also about this last webinar was by Bob Gubernik. At one step of level of inundation, we have not only problem of wood. So I mean that if maybe you could have some wood leave with big flow, but in this case, the flow has already done a lot of problems again. Je veux juste compléter en fait, c'est que Bob Gubernik, qui avait témoigné, nous disait qu'à un moment donné, s'il y a des structures qui lâchent, c'est possible, mais que si c'est pour des très fortes inondations, on a déjà d'autres problèmes, et donc en fait, ça sera mais il y a déjà du bois qui circule, et ainsi de suite. I stop it now. Maybe, do you want to add something else, Joe?
That's great.
Okay. So please, Claire Lyse, next question for you on the
yes. So it's a remark that in US it's a very big city, so there is big land, and work done in a PBR way are possible thanks to available spaces. But how it's possible to do this kind of works in a very urban land, like in Europe?
Tu peux le traduire en français?
Oui, pardon, j'ai pas ton aisance. Oui, donc les États-Unis, c'est un très grand pays avec des très grands espaces. Et comment, ce qui fait qu'on peut utiliser ce genre de technique, comment on pourrait l'utiliser dans des endroits beaucoup plus urbanisés. Voilà.
Okay, so good question, comes up a ton, especially from European audiences. You watch too much Hollywood and Netflix, and I have too many pictures that are misleading of these big, wild open spaces. Yes, we have some. Most of them have more constraints and impacts than you might realize. And if we actually systematically map our rural and our urban landscapes, we have a lot of the same constraints. I need to update this tired old slide deck to show more of those, but it's yeah. We have the exact same issues. In some ways, urban footprints, because we sprawl so much bigger, are more of a problem than here, where the cities are more compact. And when we get into rural landscapes, we're dealing with the same sorts of stuff.
Tu peux traduire?
Ou si tu veux, tu étais super à l'aise, donc mais je peux traduire comme tu veux.
Vas-y, lance-toi. Puis
Et ben en fait, il nous disait qu'on regarde sûrement trop, enfin qu'on a des images, on va dire, de la télé et des films en tête, et que du coup on a des images de très très grands espaces, mais qu'ils ont les mêmes contraintes et les mêmes problématiques que nous, et que du coup ils doivent faire face aux mêmes difficultés.
Et donc aussi qui doit comment dire, mettre à jour son PowerPoint pour montrer d'autres situations
Voilà.
et ses cartes aussi de points. Et donc ils ont effectivement des cas de zones à contrainte urbaine où c'est utilisé aussi. Tu veux que je fasse la prochaine question ou tu as une sur deux? Ok. Alors, let's me look at question. Alors, I have heard Janine Castro say that fish on trees co-evolve, but do BDAs on pals ever prevent fish from getting to their desired habitat? Donc en français, j'ai entendu Janine Castro dire que les poissons et les arbres ont coévalué, mais les structures bois fixées et les barrages type castor, les ouvrages type castor, est-ce qu'ils n'ont pas un rôle pour être négatif par rapport à l'atteinte pour les poissons de leur zone d'habitat?
Good question. Or are you done? Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah. Sure. Sometimes they can, just like natural debris jams and natural beaver dams under certain flow conditions can sometimes cause problems. Just like when I get on the road and drive my car, cars sometimes prevent me from getting to my destination, other cars. So I think we should get rid of all cars because, you know, I'm not able to get to my destination. I'm being preposterous. I'll give you the real answer with data in a second. I'll let you translate that.
Donc en fait, effectivement, potentiellement, ça peut être un problème. Et il prenait une petite caricature. Il disait en fait, c'est pas parce que en fait, quand je vais en voiture à un endroit qu'il y a des bouchons de voitures qui m'empêchent d'aller à cet endroit que je dois supprimer toutes les voitures. Donc en fait, voilà, il va rentrer plus précisément maintenant dans le sujet, please.
So we've monitored lots of fish. So, for example, in the Bridge Creek study, we had over 100,000 pit tagged fish, where and a bunch of antennas as well as mobile surveys. And we actually saw fish moving at different life stages and moving more regularly, even on a daily basis, upstream and downstream of some of these dams. We saw adult spawners able to get through. A lot of fish are migrating through these systems when there's higher flows. And so then there's these little overflow side channels and fish ladders. And we have, various studies that different groups are publishing, starting to look at fish movement data. And, yes, you can have these things act as temporary barriers, but that's not always a bad thing. The more that we actually look at the data instead of just working off of old assumptions, the more we realize that the benefits far outweigh those temporary impediments to moving around.
Ok. Donc, je vais résumer parce que c'était un peu long. Sur la partie donc poisson, il y a des études en cours et donc il y a des données. Alors, elle a cité une étude, donc je ne pourrais pas me souvenir le nom, où ils avaient observé un certain nombre de poissons. On se rend compte que il y a des mouvements autour des structures bois ou même des barrages castors, que en fait, grosso modo, les freins à la migration ne sont pas permanents. Parce qu'en fait, on a des crues et on a des multi-chenals, donc les multi-chenaux. Donc en fait, le système fait qu'il favorise, en cas de crue, le passage naturel et aussi que le système créant des multi-chenaux fait qu'il y a plein de portes de sortie. Donc c'est pas permanent en fait et qu'au global, les bénéfices sont supérieurs à, comment dire, le contraire des bénéfices, ce qui est très négatif, voilà. Et en fait, juste peut-être pour compléter, si l'homme n'était pas là, ça serait déjà, plein de bouts de bois et plein de castors et ça fonctionne depuis des milliers d'années avant qu'on soit là. I just complete to say that, before we were, on the earth, there were a lot of fish and beavers, and it was working without us. So, next question for Claire Lyse.
Yes. So do stage zero restoration project prevent all growth riparian forest for being established?
En français?
Est-ce que donc la restauration zéro empêche les forêts
Riveraines, les
riveraines,
viticoles.
voilà, les anciennes forêts riveraines de s'établir?
Claire Lyse, I missed the middle part. Do stage zero restorations prevent what? Prevent riparian?
Growth of riparian forests and establishment of riparian forests.
So if the question about stage zero is referring to geomorphic grade line, we've got actually Matthias Perl. He's on the line, that project that I showed, the low-tech video from. They've done a bunch of geomorphic grade line, and the short answer is no. It's you see incredible recruitment of vegetation, and also there's a misconception that the geomorphic grade line projects remove all of the living material and reset the elevation, and they don't. They remove the high surfaces, they leave some of what they can, and then they bring in so much wood, and you get recruitment, within months of these things. So you could translate that to no. That would be the easy thing.
Je te laisse peut-être Antoine, parce que c'est un peu technique pour moi.
En fait, donc le système, je vais essayer de traduire ça correctement. Le système avec les bois mis en place, c'est qu'il y a des modifications effectivement du fond des rivières, aussi en largeur. Et donc en fait, que grosso modo, la réponse, c'est que les restaurations de type stade 0, c'est-à-dire revenir à un stade avec multi-chenaux, n'empêchent pas la pousse des forêts. Et en fait, ce qui se passe, c'est qu'elles ne sont pas forcément au même endroit que aujourd'hui. Puisqu'en fait, la plaine finalement va être plus large et donc le système va évoluer et donc on aura des patchs avec des plus anciennes, des plus nouvelles. En fait, ça va être un système mouvant. I just completed to say that it will be something like a moving system, and we will have some patch going from youth riparian, old riparian. It would move, so it's just messy. It's messy. Alors, next question. A mess river is an healthy river. River needs space such as pupils needs break time in school. Some for those two pictures which will be useful to try to convince people who are not sensible to usually agreement. En fait, c'était un commentaire. Merci donc pour les deux images que vous avez exposées. Une rivière en bordel est une rivière en bonne santé. Les rivières ont besoin d'espace, tout comme les écoliers ont besoin de leur récré. Cette façon imagée pourra peut-être contribuer à convaincre ceux qui ne sont pas sensibles à nos arguments usuels, sans doute beaucoup moins parlants. So I go to the next question. Alors, comment calibrer les aménagements pour que la rivière ne déborde pas au-delà d'une limite fixée avec les riverains, pour gagner petit à petit de l'approbation et la confiance de ceux-ci? Let me translate, please. Hop, just. Alors, how to calibrate the facilities so that the river does not overflow beyond the limit fixed with the residents, to gradually gain the approval and trust of those.
Yeah, maybe not all at once. Maybe incrementally. We don't need to necessarily go in and reclaim the entire riverscape. It can be a little bit of a piece at a time, and we can see how things go. Also, there's a lot more. It's politically much easier the day after a major catastrophic flood where everybody is thinking of rebuilding in the same stupid place, to propose doing something different and rebuilding that infrastructure either elsewhere or in a way that can allow some of these floods to pass better. So so I think yeah, incrementally, but then also opportunistically with when floods happen, don't just give in to, yeah, we got to rebuild it exactly like it was. It was built wrong.
Ok, so je vais résumer en fait ce qui a été dit, c'est que effectivement, si j'ai bien compris, il ne va pas y avoir forcément dans tous les cas la reconstitution d'une rivière telle qu'elle a pu exister avant que l'homme marque son empreinte sur le territoire et reprendre toute la plaine. Donc il va falloir travailler effectivement par incrémentation, et donc aller peut-être sur des structures peut-être moins ambitieuses à certains endroits. En fait, quand on fera ce qu'on pourra, il disait qu'on pouvait aussi travailler par opportunisme suite à des inondations. Alors effectivement, je voudrais juste compléter sur une question en fait, qui est très importante, c'est le foncier. Finalement, le frein à la restauration de rivières telles qu'on a pu les décrire là, avec un espace important, c'est l'outil foncier. Et je voudrais juste rappeler que, par exemple, en Suisse, ils ont mis donc dans la loi un espace réservé aux eaux, qui est d'une taille minimale pour les petits cours d'eau, et après, en fonction de la taille des cours d'eau, devient de plus en plus grande. Et ce qui leur permet après d'accompagner ça financièrement pour rendre tolérable vis-à-vis des riverains, notamment les agriculteurs, le fait de perdre du terrain en termes d'exploitabilité. Et donc, en fait, si on veut réussir à gagner de l'espace, il y a des questions de compensation financière qui doivent être peut-être étudiées et mises sur la table. I just completed your answer because to say that the next the connective problem we had is that about the question of the earth owner, I mean le foncier. I don't know how to say that foncier in English.
Oh, sorry if I misunderstood.
Foncier, c'est comment on dit le foncier en anglais, webinaire Claire Lyse Attends, je vais chercher. The landowners, the private landowners, they will be afraid to lose capacity to use the earth to grain plants or whatever. So we have to have a policy to make this larger rivers possible. And I told about the Switzerland example, that they create river space limits for the small rivers, 5 meters at least in each part of the river. And in this space, you can't do what you want, but there is grants to compensate the loss of exploitation. So we need to go further and to be more ambitious to create these tools that we don't have already. So the Switzerland example is quite a good idea to maybe think about it. Next question, tu peux la faire?
Oui, tout à fait. Avez-vous utilisé ce type de technique ou d'autres approches en rivière navigable? So, have you used this kind of techniques or other approaches on rivers with boats?
With big boats, like real navigation, moving commerce, or with like kayaks?
Yes, no, real boats.
No, I think that there are some limited opportunities for this sort of stuff on big navigable rivers, on side channels and on floodplain systems, where especially some of these systems, if they have a little bit of room and you can still have your main shipping channel, and then you can have side channels, and you see this with natural beaver dam activity. But no, we've avoided those for rather obvious reasons. I will say beaver dams are pretty fun to kayak over in high flow. Wood jams, I'm not so fond of in a kayak, but we there are some really so Natalie Kramer Anderson and colleagues have come up with a pretty nice sort of risk assessment. And, you know, if you map out where the recreational, you know, sort of boating opportunities are, you can definitely avoid unnecessary high risk situations.
Ok. Donc sur les voies navigables avec des grands bateaux, c'est pas envisageable, c'est trop compliqué, c'est difficile voilà, à envisager. Par contre, sur des rivières avec du kayak, ça peut être réfléchi. Et pour éviter tout risque au kayaki, si les zones de récréatifs sont connues, c'est quelque chose qui peut être envisagé.
Je compléterai juste sur un point. En fait, sur l'expérimentation dans les rivières navigables avec les grands bateaux, hein, je veux dire les bateaux, les péniches. Donc en fait, on a l'exemple des Hollandais qui ont mis en place des embâcles fixés dans les chenaux fluviaux sont plus utilisés. Donc ça, c'est un premier cas. Mais aussi dans le chenal traversé par les bateaux. Et ils ont fixé ça effectivement pas sur le trajet du bateau, mais sur les endroits les plus sécurisés. Alors effectivement, là, ils prennent des gros moyens, ils mettent carrément du béton, des poutres au béton pour lester. Ça peut être discutable, mais en tout cas sur l'effet biologique, il y a des mesures effectivement importantes d'efficacité, puisqu'en fait, c'est des systèmes qui n'avaient plus de bois. Et maintenant, en fait, en réintroduisant le bois, ils ont retrouvé des espèces qui pensaient avoir disparu. C'est juste qu'en fait, l'écosystème d'habitat avait disparu et ils ont bien de nouveau ces poissons parce qu'on réintroduit l'habitat. Just to complete that, we had testimony from Rick Verterstadt. It's a Netherlands state company that's taking care about already about boating of big boats and also about recreate natural environment. And they use wood in the Rhine River and some also big rivers in side channels, but not only side channels, also in the rivers that are with the boats, but not on the way of the boats, but on the side board. And but they wanted to be sure, so they use concrete to load the wood down the river. But we can discuss about this possibility and use concrete, okay? But anyway, they had results because they have seen that coming back some fish species that disappeared. In fact, they had not disappeared, that the habitats which were not there, and when they recreate wood habitats, the fish coming back, and they had a lot of fish. So that we can show that it's useful also in big rivers.
That's wood and habitat structures, but you know, they're going to be more engineered, less low tech, and you know, you're probably going to be installing those things from a barge as opposed to you know, you're not wading in the river. So yeah, good point from the previous seminar, that's really viable. There's a bunch of methods, but the low tech is less applicable in those settings.
Et donc le commentaire, c'est effectivement que sur le cas où on a des enjeux forts, on est moins sur du low tech, on est avec des barges, on est avec du béton, et voilà. Et en fait, on adapte finalement, comme vous disiez, c'est it depends, ça dépend. Et ça va être un peu du cas par cas.
There you go.
Next question. De nombreux projets concernent les effacements de seuils et de barrages. Les solutions low-tech comme les équivalents de barrages Castor semblent avoir les mêmes effets que les seuils. Comment concilier les deux? Barrage de Castor et seuil artificiel en béton humain, même combat, point d'interrogation. Faut-il renoncer à l'effacement des seuils? A lot of projects consist at removing dam on weirs. Low-tech solution like Beaver Dam Analog seems to have the same impact than weirs. How are they different? Are those two things the same? And should we abandon the destruction of weirs?
Great question. It's confusing. The messaging is confusing because on the one hand, we talk about removing man-made structures like weirs, because they are a migration and passage barrier. I'll let you translate that part first.
Alors, en fait, il y a beaucoup de confusion entre les 2 types de barrages. Et là, en fait, il faut différencier ce qui concerne effectivement les barrages faits par l'homme des barrages de castors. Let's please continue.
So answering the last question first, should we abandon these destruction of these weirs and removal of some of these weirs? I don't think so. I think that there's a lot of benefit to removal of unnecessary dams, removal of unnecessary weirs, fish passage and migration in those sorts of situations, even with fish ladders, is really, really difficult. So those projects do make sense.
Donc en fait, sur la partie, donc on va répondre à la fin de la question, faut-il arrêter de supprimer des barrages artificiels en béton? La réponse est non. En fait, les bénéfices tirés de ces retraits des barrages qui seraient aujourd'hui inutiles et qui n'ont plus d'usage, sont très importants, notamment, par rapport à la migration, puisqu'en fait, même supposons que les barrages soient équipés de passes à poissons, ils ne sont pas suffisamment efficients pour permettre le passage des poissons. D'ailleurs, là-dessus, il y a des études qui montrent que les passes à poissons sont, souvent, soit mal conçues, entre guillemets, c'est pas une critique, hein, c'est que c'est difficile à concevoir, et soit, en termes d'entretien, c'est pas entretenu et il y a un effet filtre qui fait qu'au cumul, à la fin, si on a 10 passes à poissons, ben, il n'y a plus beaucoup de poissons qui passent. I just completed to say that if we add efficiency study about fish passages, we can constate that there is difficult to build efficiency fish passage because life is not easy. Secondly, when we see that these fish passages are not really well cared by the people, there is wood inside, it's not working. And also when you accumulate, by example, 10 fish passage, you can see that it will not be able for the fish to go along all these 10 passage to the end so easily. So there is, at least if there is 100 fishes at the beginning, at the end there is not so much, maybe 10, 1, I don't know, but really it's not so easy. Please continue.
Yeah, so they do seem conceptually similar, but they're very different. These man-made structures are built to last, and they're built often with very uniform hydraulics that, you know, if you're kayaking in these things, they're scary. They're like death traps, you know, to go over. Whereas, you know, natural beaver dams and temporary beaver dam analogs, they don't last forever. They're ephemeral. They come and they go. So even if it is a barrier for a while, it's rare that that's a barrier for forever. And they just have much more diverse ways for fish to move through, around, up and over, much better than an engineered fish ladder. So they're ephemeral and they're much more complex. And in that complexity gives lots of little resting spots. And it's easier for fish to, you know, make their way through lots of little pieces, for example, on the mattress of a beaver dam, than it would be on, you know, a big, you know, drop weir structure.
Donc en fait, les structures sont très différentes de conception, notamment du fait qu'en termes d'ingénierie, un barrage en béton, par exemple, ou en pierre, sera très uniforme et il sera même, je dirais, en fait, d'un point de vue, je dirais l'exemple qui était cité en kayak, qui peut faire même peur, entre guillemets, pour rapport à sa façon de passer. Et en fait, les barrages donc de type castor ou les barrages faits par les castors, les ouvrages de type castor ou les barrages faits par les castors sont très peu uniformes. Donc en fait, il peut y avoir des voies de contournement qui se mettent en place à l'occasion des crues normalement. Et en fait, ils ne durent pas dans le temps. C'est qu'en fait, il faut imaginer qu'il y a une crue, le barrage casse, il bouge, ils vont en construire un, et ainsi de suite. Donc il va y avoir un nouveau passage, et ainsi de suite. Ce qui fait qu'au global, l'effet n'est pas permanent. Et si on peut comparer, entre guillemets, le fait que les deux vont avoir un impact sur le niveau d'eau, en termes de franchissement, c'est pas du tout la même chose. Le franchissement des barrages de castor, il va se faire, même quand le barrage existe, ça peut se faire du fait des chenaux secondaire du fait que le barrage va se casser suite au truc. So I just completed to say that anyway, if we can say that all the dams have an effect on the level of the water, it's not the same on the capacity for fish to go ahead or down.
Did you? I couldn't tell. Did you mention this discussion we've been having about? I mean, Beaver Dam has been an unfortunate word, and Beaver Dam Analog maybe an even more unfortunate term in English because of the connotations with dam. And did you mention the conversations about instead of barrage, maybe talking about castor works or, I mean, like there's an opportunity in the translation to maybe not make some of the same hangups that we've had.
En fait, donc pour la traduction, on s'est posé la question de savoir finalement est-ce qu'on peut utiliser le même terme, parce que barrage de castor et barrage artificiel, on utilise le même terme. Et est-ce que c'était pertinent de garder les mêmes termes en termes de, comment dire, de médias en fait, par rapport aux gens à qui on va parler, pour expliquer les choses. Donc c'est pour ça notamment qu'en fait, les BDA, Beaver Dam Analog, on a traduit ça, donc jusqu'à maintenant en fait, c'est un vocabulaire à construire, c'est par le terme ouvrage de type castor. Donc parce que c'est pas vraiment entre guillemets, on pourrait pas dire que ça correspond à un barrage tel qu'on a l'idée dans la tête. Et après donc pour ce qui est des barrage de castor, bon, on peut traduire ça aussi par ouvrage de castor, mais bon, on essaie de trouver des termes un peu différents. Donc en fait, l'enjeu aussi qu'on va avoir dans le discours, c'est de pouvoir faire comprendre que ce sont des choses différentes. Donc les mots utilisés vont être importants. I just finished to say that we had some difficulty to choose the terms for translation to keep some difference between some concepts which should be simplified to the same, but they are not. Claire Lyse, the next question?
Yes, it's the last question. It's more a comment. It's about water authorities. So it's with this kind of approach, empirical approach, it's not possible to do good hydraulic modeling. And this modeling are needed for the authority application. So we need to convince the water authorities that it's good like that. Donc en français, il reste à convaincre les services de police de l'eau qu'avec ce type d'approche qui sont empiriques, on ne pourra pas faire de belles modélisations hydrauliques pour les dossiers d'autorisation.
Joe?
Comment, Joe? Yeah.
You want to comment on that? I mean, some of us...
You can give us your approach in USA, because in France, I would say that exactly as we explained, we are used to staff system, and when we have to introduce it again, it's such a shock. I mean, to keep in mind that it should be like that. How to convince? How do you do in USA?
Yeah, well, we have similar sorts of things where people, often the regulatory bodies, it's habit, right? This is what we always require on this sort of project. And so we have to work with them closely to explain why some of those things may not be necessary or may not be that helpful, and see if we can get at the spirit of why they're requiring those models, and answer the questions in more pragmatic and simple ways. I do have a comment about the water authorities though here in France, but I'll let you translate that first.
Je te laisse le faire.
Oh, vas-y.
Attends, parce que là j'ai un peu décroché. Tu veux pas commencer? J'ai décroché.
Do you want me to say it again?
On
Yeah,
fatigue un peu.
Let's see, more concisely. We have to work with the regulators to help them understand these projects and simplify some of the requirements. And we've had similar hurdles. So
Ok, donc en fait, il y a les mêmes problèmes entre guillemets aux USA où finalement il faut quand même négocier et permettre finalement il y a une acculturation aussi des services de police, si j'ai bien compris, à ces questions-là.
It starts though working in the areas where people are comfortable to give it a try, have a pilot, and then if things start getting traction, then we end up having to work at a higher level in these government agencies to bring about changes, right? And it can be done. It just takes time. It takes patience.
Okay.
I do want to comment on actually, at least in the Rhone, the water authorities are actually really interested in this, and the little video I showed at the very end, that is with them in full partnership, finding a way to streamline requirements.
Donc en fait, si j'ai bien compris, donc l'idée c'est qu'il faut passer par des phases comment dire, des phases successives où on prend confiance dans le système. Et donc, en fait, l'idée, c'est de passer par des zones où on peut tester avec des gens qui sont partants et pour créer en fait du lien, de confiance et de pouvoir ainsi faire évoluer les choses au fur et à mesure. Et en complément, il disait que sur la partie du Rhône, les autorités locales étaient plutôt, comment dire, en demande d'expérimentation sur ce type-là. Donc, je crois que j'ai traduit à peu près correctement. Corrigez si j'ai dit une erreur. Est-ce qu'on a une autre question?
No, it was the last question, and there is a lot of thank you to Joe and to this very interesting presentation. And there is also several articles.
Yeah.
Ok. Donc, pour conclure, je dirais que ce webinaire fait partie d'un ensemble de webinaires donc, qui sont à disposition sur la chaîne Réseau Rivière TV. Donc là, je vous mets un lien dans le chat où vous verrez une vidéo en français et la même existe en anglais sur le précédent webinaire. Il y aura d'autres webinaires à venir, notamment un le 12 juin, dont j'ai mis le lien avec Yes River. On va montrer des exemples de réalisation en Europe et aux États-Unis sur plusieurs types de méthodes, donc les forages type castor, les fixations de bois, la restauration du stade 0. Et donc ensuite, on compte bien continuer l'aventure avec un webinaire après l'été sur les castors, spécifiquement leur réintroduction, les difficultés de réintroduction, les difficultés de gérer des espaces où il y a des castors, parce qu'en fait, effectivement, ça fait comment on gère ça avec les agriculteurs qui sont, par exemple, exploitants des terres. On aura des exemples, notamment de la Suisse, qui a mis en place un plan de gestion du castor. Donc voilà, quelques idées qu'on va essayer de développer dans la suite des webinaires. Et on mettra en ligne aussi toute une documentation liée à ces vidéos. Juste pour terminer, pour rappeler qu'il y a un groupe de travail sur le bois, en fait, avec des chercheurs qui se met en place en Europe. Et donc, en fait, on pourra alimenter toutes ces réflexions et les liens entre les chercheurs et les gestionnaires. So just to finish, to say that this webinar was a part of some of the webinar. So I put a link with Réseau Rivière TV, which is the place we put the webinars about this subject. And we will have next time, 12th of June, webinar with ES Rivers and UCRR about this about examples that were done in Europe and the USA about BDA, PALS, and the state zero restoration. And we will continue also after summer with a webinar about beavers, reintroduction, problems to live with beavers activity, example from Switzerland. They plan to do that. So we put documentation and link with this video. You can find it under the video description. And just to say that there is a good group of researchers which is beginning to be construct in Europe. And so we will try to backlink regularly between this group and also the people who are working on the fields. So what to say more? Nothing.
Thank you very much to Joe and to
you,
everything that he gave to the H2 Lyon community and to the French community. So thank you very much, Joe, for this year and for the presentation of today. We are really happy to work with you.
Okay, I forget one
Merci
thing.
beaucoup.
Is that to say that maybe at the end of the year or next year, we will do another webinar with Joe about your work. Joe, could you say just 2 words about your work? You told about your tools.
2 words, Riverscape Consortium. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tools and models that support the expectation management behind this. What I've actually been doing on my sabbatical here with you all.
Okay.
But
So,
merci beaucoup for everything. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Et donc pour terminer, juste pour dire qu'on envisage aussi fin d'année ou début d'année 2023, 24, de faire un webinaire avec Jo de nouveau pour qu'il présente sa boîte à outils en fait, qu'il essaie de mettre en place donc avec des collègues européens. Could you give me the name also of this tools box? I don't remember.
Oh, well, there's a plethora of tools. I'll put in the thing that it's just riverscapes the Riverscape Consortium. So I'll put the link in real quick here.
Donc il s'appellera Riverscape Consortium et donc nous aurons l'occasion d'en reparler la prochaine fois. Thank you very much for all. Thank you very much for H2 Lyon for all the stuff you have done to organize that with me. And thank you, Joe, for time you prepare this stuff. And so I see you next time.
Yeah.
And thank you for the community of wood. I hope we will be more. Merci à tous. Merci à Joe pour le travail qu'il a mis en place. Merci à H2 Lyon pour le travail pour la préparation du webinaire. Et j'espère qu'on pourra continuer à construire cette communauté du bois autour des rivières.